Hi everyone, thank you for watching the program Meet the Professionals. Today we are very honored to have Dr. Deb Henneberry joining us. Dr. Henneberry, I'm very curious about your professional experience. So what drew you to the field of aviation? And how did you become a pilot? And what made you decide to then become an aviation professor?
Okay. Well, I didn't start out as a pilot or a professor. Aviation always interested me, and as a child, sometimes I would express, interest to family members who were in the Air Force, things like that. I talked to my parents a little bit, and I was told, it's very expensive to get into, and well, the flight training is expensive. It's hard to get around that, although nowadays there are many scholarships available. But I was told you have to have perfect vision, you have to be in the military, and none of that's true anymore. Maybe 40, 50 years ago, things were different. So I kind of put it out of my mind. And after I finished school, I went into a career, and I wasn't really too fond of the career. So I thought, why don't I start exploring other options, maybe get some hobbies that would really interest me. So I did what a lot of people do, and I went for a demo flight. Which is just where you go up for an hour and take control of an airplane, see how you like it. And like many people, I loved it as soon as I first did it. And I kind of decided on the spot, this was something that I wanted to pursue. So I did get my first rating. I stayed in New York and did that up here. And then just because I was getting a little older and I just wanted to finish up, I moved down to Florida, and I did I guess I did my next 10 ratings down there very quickly. Then I moved back to New York and started flight instructing. I did that for a few years. I flew with a lot of people who own their own airplanes, so I would be their personal pilot. And then I started to go down a few other roads, a little bit outside of aviation. But a friend of mine told me about Vaughn College, and he'd been telling me about it for years. And he said, yeah, we really want you there. So he brought my resume in, and the department chair at the time, she gave me a call the next day, and we hit it off. And I've been teaching at Vaughn for 10 years now.
So when you piloted for the first time, and how did you overcome the fear?
Wasn't afraid the first time I piloted the airplane because I had a flight instructor with me. So that made me feel comfortable. There were times though that, during the lessons, sometimes turbulence and things like that, because I didn't understand it yet, that would bother me. But as I grew to understand why those things happen, and then I just became more accustomed to encountering those things more, I just kind of didn't even notice it anymore. And it didn't really occur to me until one time I took up a brand new student, and he goes, "Oh my God, does the airplane always shake like this?" And I didn't even know what he was talking about. So I think you just kind of get used to stuff.
What's the most rewarding thing about your job? What do you enjoy about being a pilot and a professor?
Well, as far as the piloting goes, which I don't really do anymore, but when I did fly, I just considered it such a privilege because this was something that people had probably only dreamed of doing for thousands and thousands of years, seeing what a bird sees. And here I was actually doing it. So what I loved was the perspective. Things just seemed kind of closer together and more interconnected when you're flying. So you just look at things in a different way. But as a professor, that has been the most rewarding because I get to see what my students do after graduation. So I meet them as freshmen usually. So they don't know very much. They haven't flown yet, probably. And I spend 4 years with them, and I see them progress during those 4 years, start accomplishing goals. And then after graduation, not too long after graduation, in fact, they'll end up going into the airlines or maybe charter. Some of them have gone into the Air Force. And just to see how great they're doing. Some of them now are flying some of the biggest airplanes ever produced. So it's an honor to have just played a small part in that process with them.
What's the most challenging thing about your job being a pilot?
Well, being a pilot, sometimes you have to make decisions that people don't always like, and they might not understand why you're making a decision, just because they don't know the theory behind what you're basing your decision on. So there's that. And then in terms of teaching, I think that there are a few topics that we have to do in aviation that are, I guess I would call them abstract. And so some people, especially based on, their tendencies and their background, they might really struggle with these topics. So we have to spend a lot of time on them, and I have to think of different ways to communicate what I'm trying to get across to them. And usually with time it works out, but that can be a very frustrating process while it's going on.
How about the most challenging thing about being a professor?
Is probably just because the topics can be so hard, and sometimes there's a lot to cover. So trying to get that done on time, trying to get students everything they need. Sometimes I see them taking flight lessons, and either the instructor they're using or the school they're going to, or just with other things going on in their lives, it's just clearly a bad match. And I can give advice, but it is frustrating to see students going down a road that, under the current conditions, it's much harder than it should be. And there's not really a whole lot I can do to change that for them other than give them advice. But, I don't know all the circumstances behind what's going on. And even though I may give them advice, they may not be able to change course at the moment.
Right. Between driving and the piloting, how do you compare the risk?
I think driving's riskier, especially driving through Queens every day. And I work right next to LaGuardia Airport, so I think, oh my God, I could just fly here. What I do is I get up at about 5 a.m. so I can beat most of the traffic there, and I get there just insanely early. But I'd rather get there and just have breakfast and calm down than be sitting in traffic aggravated for a few hours. But I guess there are some similarities, just in terms of spatial relationships, those kind of things. Of course, flying is there's more to it because you're moving in a third dimension. So there's more to consider. And you're actually, instead of being on the ground, you're moving through a fluid, which is very different. But yeah, I'd say there are some similarities. There has been some research done between people who have accidents in the kitchen and the bathroom, and people have car accidents, and then people who have airplane accidents. I don't know, especially with the pandemic, some of the research seemed to have, kind of slowed down for a little while. But that's something that they're working on, seeing the correlations between different types of accidents.
As self-driving cars become more and more popular, what is the possibility and the impact of self-driving airplanes?
Well, we do have the unmanned, or they call them small unmanned air systems. So what we call them drones. So yeah, those are becoming prevalent. They can usually be done, in a lot of capacities. They can be done, in the civilian world, like things like photography and things like that for real estate or just surveying or something like that. That's becoming quite popular, and so this would be a much smaller device. It's probably better for the environment. The military has been using large unmanned air systems for many years now. We even see it now with Russia and the Ukraine, that drones are playing a large role in what's going on there. In terms of in aviation, that kind of like a passenger airplane that people get in, I imagine one day it could come to that point, but I don't think it's coming to that point in my lifetime. Right now, when you get on an airliner, a lot of them are required by law to have two pilots. And we could see a situation where, because of all the automation that's on board the airplane, that might get cut back to one pilot. I think there will be a lot of resistance to that because there are a lot of inherent benefits to having two pilots on board. Not that this happens often, but just something very obvious, like what if the one pilot on board got incapacitated? Now there is no pilot left. So that doesn't happen a lot, but from a decision-making perspective and a workload perspective, and if something malfunctions, you see a huge increase in safety by having two people on board. But I think that might get revisited at some point, and I think that it will have to go through a lot of research. There'll probably be a lot of lobbying, a lot of law changing. I don't know about people getting on airliners that don't have a human flying it anytime soon.
Someone is considering a career in aviation, but not sure about which direction to pursue, like private versus commercial. So what are the pros and cons of each?
It's funny because a lot of people, when they think of aviation, they think of airlines because that seems like, it seems so big. And I think all it is the most obvious, and it's actually quite small in terms of all the opportunities that are out there. So some of my people who graduate, after spending 4 years at Vaughn with me, they go down different roads. So some people do choose military because that lifestyle appeals to them and the mission appeals to them. Some people are ending up doing charter, and they're very happy with that. That might fit their lifestyle better. And a lot of people are doing cargo now. Some of the best jobs, oddly enough, are in cargo. Some of the the very big companies, their jobs are fantastic. And then as we see things like people order from Amazon, that a lot of people are flying those kind of cargo planes now. So I think that's worth considering. I would look just if you go join some of the social media groups, you can see comparisons as to like a lot of pilot jobs are union, and you can see under each contract what the pay, the benefits, the scheduling, the kind of equipment. That sometimes that really draws people, is they have their heart set on one particular airplane. Just for some reason, they've always wanted to fly this airplane. So they may seek out either the airline or the cargo carrier or whoever who flies this airplane, and they'll start pursuing those individual companies. But there are groups that people can join as well. That are good resources when people first start up just flying, going through their lessons. One good organization is AOPA. They have lots of resources. So you can join them. But then there's some other more career-oriented ones. There's one called Women in Aviation, which, despite its name, is actually for everybody. There's many, many, many male members of Women in Aviation. In fact, their conference is going on right now, and I have a lot of male students who are at that conference this week. So those kind of organizations, not only are they a good source of information, and you're more likely to be given good information, but there's also networking opportunities, a lot of them. And so I'm sure right now, as I'm speaking, there's probably 20 different job interviews going on right now, at least at that conference. So yeah, just meet other people and kind of get feedback as to what's available.
Awesome. Thank you. So do you feel there are certain people who are naturally talented and being a good pilot, or do you feel like anyone who puts sufficient effort could actually be a good pilot?
Well, it would be nice to think the latter, but there are some limitations in place. So you do need a medical clearance from the FAA. So some people are not going to be a pilot just because they can't get that medical clearance. And there are avenues that you can appeal if you get turned down. So, back in the day being not even that long ago, certain things, diabetes, high blood pressure, those kind of things were really, really scrutinized. And they still are, but they're not a deal breaker. And so you might be able to get some kind of almost like an exception to the medical, but you'd have to keep in touch with the medical examiner, maybe go in for checkups more recent, on a more ongoing basis. So the FAA has gotten better at looking at things on a case-by-case basis there. The other thing is hand-eye coordination. I don't know what goes behind, if people were born with it, or if it's maybe it's a skill that maybe, I guess, with practice you can develop. People with poor hand-eye coordination would probably struggle. And then the other thing is that it is a lot of time studying. So a lot of the ratings that you get, it's a lot of time just sitting with the books. and there's just so much content that you just have to read through it many, many, many times. And people have to be willing to make that kind of sacrifice. As much as it's an exciting profession and unique and all those kind of things, a lot of times we're just reading maps, and so that sometimes people get into it like, oh, I didn't think this is how it was going to be. But it's a lot of stuff like learning systems, learning to read charts, being able to envision things in your head without being able to see them. In fact, one thing that kind of surprised me, pilots have a fear of heights overall, and you would think that pilots wouldn't. But I'm afraid of heights, and we did some studies on this. And of course, they're always doing more studies to kind of figure out more about how we think. Pilots are very good at visualizing trajectories. And so when they're high up, they can very easily envision themselves falling, which was what would make somebody nervous. So a fear of heights, I think that's in the vast majority of pilots, just because you have to be able to see how something's going to work out.
What are the physical requirements for the pilot?
Well, they're a little bit more flexible these days because we need so many pilots. I think the latest study from Boeing we need well over 600,000 new pilots in the next 20 years just to keep up with current demand. That's not even, saying if the demand increases, which it probably will. But they've kind of modified some cockpits in the military. So, you can take shorter people now, a little shorter people on, the much taller end of things. Those people can be accommodated. That wasn't something that was being looked at as much in the past. Now it's being looked at now. The only thing I would say is that in terms of the physical requirements, so you have to be in reasonably good health. If there was something in your background, like a sudden loss of consciousness, things like that, that would have to be, they'd have to identify why this happened. Certain psychological disorders, the FAA is not going to approve. Some things they've gotten a little better about on a case-by-case basis, but some psychological illnesses are a deal breaker. Certainly heart issues, epilepsy, that kind of stuff that could just suddenly cause you to pass out or just not be able to do what you need to do. Those kind of things the FAA would not approve.
What types of jobs are in the aviation field? Are they in high demand?
Absolutely. It's absolutely incredible, the signing bonuses that people are getting right now, especially coming out of the pandemic where people wanted to travel again. We can't pump out the pilots fast enough and the airlines can't train them fast enough. That's actually the limitation, is that there's only so many simulators available and only so many hours a day. And they will schedule people all 24 hours. But there's only so many people they can work through at a time. So yes, so pilots, mechanics, dispatchers, flight attendants, anybody that's got anything to do with an airplane, it's all very much in demand right now. As I was saying before, Boeing has an outlook they update every year. The most recent one, I think we're closing in on 700,000 pilots, not even people that just, who are already pilots, like me, not me, 700,000 more of me are needed in the next 20 years. And then that number will probably increase because every time Boeing revises their outlook, they're seeing this increasing need because we do have emerging markets. So, in Africa, the Middle East, countries that in the past didn't have a very strong aviation industry, now they do. And of course, the pandemic affected everybody. But yeah, there's some great prospects that are coming out of other parts of the world. And, the United States leads the world in flight training. So a lot of people from these parts of the world, they'll come to the United States to do flight training, and then they'll go back home, or people who grew up in the United States, they'll take a job in another part of the world. And because pilots are so hard to come by, it might not be possible to train pilots in that country. The pilots are going to be very much in demand and very nicely paid.
I think many people are curious about what type of pilots get paid the most.
Some of the cargo ones, oddly enough, I just saw something. I have to look into this a little further because I heard about it and I'm trying to find it. Not that I'm applying for this job, but I saw a chief pilot job at a cargo carrier being advertised for $750,000 a year. That's not the norm. That's at the extreme end, but I've never even heard of anything like that. So it just goes to show that, a regular line pilot, if you get on whatever, JetBlue, American, Delta, United, any of those, no, the person in the cockpit's not making $750,000 a year, but they are making a nice salary.
So how many aviation colleges are there in the US? And how do you compare the college offering aviation training with a flight training school? So do you think it's necessary for students to get a college degree before attending a flight school?
That's a great question, and that's actually been discussed quite a bit lately. So I believe it was one of the mainline carriers. They had said that, no, you don't need a 4-year degree to be hired. And it's kind of interesting because if your son or daughter wanted to be a doctor, you'd send them to medical school. If your son or daughter wanted to be a lawyer, you'd send them to law school. So you would think if your son or daughter wants to be a pilot, you'd send them to aviation school. You don't have to. They can go just directly to a flight school. Now, I would say at a certain point, not having a 4-year degree would interfere. So if you're at one of the mainline carriers, American, Delta, United, you're probably not upgrading to captain without a 4-year degree. But can you get the foot in the door without a 4-year degree? Absolutely. Now, I don't want to put down necessarily going to college for aviation because I think that you do learn a lot more. You meet a lot more people. You have a lot more opportunities by going to an aviation college than if you're just going to a mom and pop flight school at your local airport. And the other thing is that because of an accident that happened in 2009, the laws in the United States changed where if you want to go to an American-based airline, you have to have logged at least 1,500 hours. But the FAA will allow a decrease. They'll allow you to go to the airlines at 1,000 hours if you graduate from one of these 4-year degree programs like we have at Vaughn. So I would also say, though, consider going to school for something else, not aviation, simply because you're putting all your eggs in one basket. Even our accrediting agencies say that flying is not a transferable skill set. So, just because you know how to fly doesn't mean that you know how to file your taxes or whatever. So, I almost encourage people to study something else in case they lose their medical, they have a backup job plan. But at the same time, we know that when people get through college and they don't drop out, it's because they were engaged. And so maybe if somebody is studying what they're passionate about, they're more likely to finish college. And as I said, yes, they sooner or later, they really would want to have a 4-year degree, even though it doesn't really matter what it's in. And as far as how many flight schools we have in the or aviation colleges we have in the United States, we have several dozen. So I'm thinking right around the New York City area. There's the one I work at, and then there's one other on Long Island. There's a few upstate. Not many in our part of the country, but if you go to Florida, there are several. If you go down south, you'll find a few in the Midwest. Out by North Dakota, there's a very good one. So you do find them. Some of them are kind of small, and then some of them are big, like the Embry-Riddles. They're huge. They're very well known. I think that there's good and bad to all schools. You have to find what's the right fit, because if you go to a very large school, you might just feel like lost in the crowd. Or if you go to a smaller school like Vaughn, you might feel like you have more opportunity to stand out, and more things may come your way. Another thing to look at is this a private college like Vaughn College or University of North Dakota? That's a public school. So, in terms of the state you live in, there's going to be differences in tuition. And that's the other thing, by the way, is we all know what college tuition is. It's quite a bit. So realize you have college tuition and you have the cost of your flight training. That's going to add up quite a bit.
What's the average time for becoming a pilot?
So it's all a function of how often you go in for your flight training. So people think if they go in all the time, they're spending all this money up front, but they're actually ending up saving money, because when you're not flying, you're forgetting how to fly. So we find that people who get through flight training in the shortest amount of time were actually very consistent. They were flying a minimum of 3 times a week. So if you're flying a minimum of 3 times a week, I would say that reasonably you could expect to get your first rating, which is the private pilot rating, probably in several months. I put it at maybe 6 months, something like that, if you're pretty consistent. The next rating that comes after that is the instrument rating. The difference between the two, because neither are a professional level rating, but it's a step that you have to go through. So a visual pilot flies on a day where they can see where they're going. The clouds are high up, the visibility is good. They can't fly for pay, but they can fly when they can see where they're going. With the instrument rating, you're probably still not flying for pay, but you're flying through clouds, you're flying through very poor visibility. If you are consistent, I would say you could get the instrument rating in the same amount of time as you got the private. So I would put another 6 months on that. The next rating is the commercial. That is where you become a professional pilot, but there's a lot of time building involved. So that could take a while. And then the next ones that you go through, you could do a multi-engine, which for people who want to be professional pilots, you have to do that. You really do need it. But it's actually quite simple. And I got mine in 7 hours. So it can be, or 7 hours of flight time. So with a few 2 or 3 days, you just have to study and practice. And then you get the flight instructor ratings. That's a lot of ground school. It's actually not a lot of flying, but it is a lot of studying the books. So it's all a matter of how consistent you are. So just to use me as an example, when I went and did my private rating, the first one, it took me 1.5 years because I was only going after work and on weekends. And I actually had 2 surgeries to get my legs rebuilt. So I had to stop flying twice for 3 or 4 months as my legs healed. So that's why it took so long. And when you take a break like that, you don't pick up where you left off. So I think the national average right now to finish your private pilot rating is in the 70s in the hours, 70 something hours. I think I finished up mine around 90 hours, just because, I was taking these breaks. But then at the same time, I realized I'm never going to finish if I'm going at this pace, only nights, only weekends. So that's why I just stopped everything and moved to Florida. And I got my next 10 ratings in 100 days because that was the only thing I was doing. So it can be quite quick. If anyone decides to go through an accelerated program, you could go within a year of having no ratings to almost all the ratings. It's just how much time you have to commit.
Just a little bit about the 2 types of training, ground training and the flight training.
Oh, yeah, they do go hand in hand. And for every rating you do, you'll need both. So the flight training is just the actual time in the airplane. So as soon as you turn the engine on to when you turn it off, I would say based on, scheduling and your thresholds as to how much you can tolerate at once, a typical flight lesson would usually go for, at the beginning, probably 1.5 hours, 2 hours, something like that. But we also, like you said, we do the ground training, which is just going over the stuff from the textbooks, and the textbooks are pretty big. So we have to do both. What we try to do is if we have a really nice day, that's the day that we want to fly. But one day we're scheduled to have a lesson and it's going to be rainy and windy and all that, that would be a good day to either get in the simulator or do some of the book work together. It has to be balanced. You have to do both. And like I said, all that time you need in an airplane, you need probably far more than that on the ground.
So the profession of aviation has been a male-dominated occupation. So what's it like to be a female pilot? And have you ever noticed any advantages and disadvantages of being a female pilot?
So I wrote my doctoral dissertation on that topic because it is a big topic right now. So if we look, and this is fairly true around the world, the anomaly is India, and I think maybe it's the culture of the extended family maybe in India that's changing things. But if we look around the world, female pilots make up 6% of the total pilot population. For the professional pilot population, it goes down to 5%. And then if we start throwing other things in there, like what if this woman is not white, then it goes even lower. So Black women are far less than 1% of the total pilot population. So that's true in the United States and it's true around the world. The good news is that we're seeing initiatives to change this, just because, women, non-white people, they may not realize this is an option for them, because when we look historically, it was men coming out of the military who went into the airlines. But, between changes in foreign policy and just the explosive growth of aviation, that's not a sustainable model. We would have very few airplanes flying if that's what we were doing these days. So we really need to tap into talent pools that have not been tapped into yet. So like women, like non-whites, you can go right down the list. So the United States has a lot of initiatives. I was just reading one, a lady that I know that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. She's a Black lady. She now flies for United. She flies the 737, and she has a program called Jet Black. And her goal is to train 100 Black female pilots. So we have that. There are some very specific schools starting. Even United started their own school, or a program, I should say, to get more women in. And it's a common pushback that you hear, is that the bar is being lowered to let women in. It's not really that. The bar is the same for everybody. Everybody passes the same tests. But the problem is, if every time you get onto an airplane, you see the pilot as a white male, and don't get me wrong, we absolutely still need the white males. We need everybody. But, just subconsciously, you don't even realize this is an option. And when we look at career theory, we see that at a very early age, as early as 3 or 4 years old, when children don't see things in popular culture, on TV, friends, family, when they don't see something existing, they just kind of think this is not an option. And they unconsciously deselect something as a choice. Which is where we have to go back and say, wait a minute, you didn't need to deselect that. Have you ever considered doing, and we could go right down the whole STEM field and include aviation in that and say, maybe this is a good match for you. Why don't you give it a try? So that's why these programs are being specifically targeted towards people who didn't realize that this was a possibility. Again, it's not about lowering the bar. Over in Australia, they're having some good success there. Some of the airlines there are, I think, some 50% of the incoming class now is female. So that's good. And like I said, I think India is about, I forget exactly, but it's probably around 13-14% female pilots. So it would be good to look at what India is doing that's making this work. Unfortunately, even though we see the needle move a little bit for women entering aviation, it's not moving a whole lot. In fact, recently the needle jumped up to 7 or 8% female pilots. But the thing is that those people are not getting past the student pilot stage of things. They're never actually getting that private. They're like the indefinite student pilot. So something's going wrong at that point. It's probably a lot of different possibilities. So people feeling like they stick out. Nobody wants to feel like I'm the only person of this demographic here. That's always awkward. So things like that, just not being able to see yourself. I mean, there's been many studies done, like for graduate programs at schools, if they go to advertise the program, based on who the people are that they put on the cover of the pamphlet, that actually has a tremendous effect on who the people are that apply to the program. So a lot of it's just about, just making everybody feel welcome. And I think that we're kind of far from that right now in many ways. And, some of it is just something that we have to kind of work our way out of and rethink things. And as far as any advantages to being a female pilot, people tend to notice you more because it's an anomaly. So I remember one time, I ended up flying into the same airport in Georgia 6 times in a week. And the cab driver came to get me. And it was like the second time that week I had the same cab driver. And she goes, "Oh, wow, another female pilot." I said, "No, it's just me again."
So based on your experience, what advice would you give kids, especially for young girls who are considering a career later, maybe in the aviation field?
I would say start contacting people who are actually part of the aviation community, because they'll give you the best advice. Some people are very well intentioned, but if they haven't gone through the process, they might unintentionally give you bad advice. So reach out to local groups. You have little chapters. Like I'm chair of the Greater New York chapter of the 99s. Which was started in 1929 there were 99 female pilots who showed up, and their first president was Amelia Earhart. So kind of following in her footsteps, which is, of course, an honor. But that group's right in New York. Women in Aviation has a chapter right in New York. For everybody, AOPA, there's another organization called EAA. Look into any of those. Those are going to be all pilot groups, and they're going to be able to give you good advice as to how to get into the profession, or just some other aspect of aviation if that's interesting to you. You can also go to your local airport. So if you're on Long Island, you've got Farmingdale, you've got Brookhaven, Islip, and Ronkonkoma. Those three airports have a bunch of flight schools at each of them. Off the top of my head, I could list 10 flight schools at those three airports. So stop by those three airports if those are the closest to you. Or if you're in New Jersey or Westchester or Connecticut, there's more airports there. It's not just LaGuardia, Newark, and Kennedy. There's more than that. Stop by those airports, give the flight schools a call, and start meeting with them, and they'll start giving advice as to how to start the process.
Okay,